because in a few minutes we'll be bringing you live coverage of a forum on the Palestinians after the Gulf War. In fact, we can take a look at the room now where this is going to be. This is being sponsored by the Center for Policy Analysis in Palestine, and it looks like the hearing has started. We'll take you there now.
This is our second symposium, and it's entitled "The Palestinians After the Gulf War, the Critical Questions." The Gulf War is another major and historic turning point in contemporary Middle Eastern history. And like earlier turning points, it will have a significant impact on the question of Palestine and the destiny of the Palestinian people. Not only because the war had shattered the Arab consensus and set Arab states and to some degree Arab peoples against each other, but also because this shattering of official Arab consensus is of special relevance to the Palestinian cause. Popular Arab sentiment, however, and Islamic sentiment was and continues to be solidly behind Palestinian political and national rights. Indeed, during the crisis and Gulf War, this Arab and Islamic public opinion was outraged at the double standard exhibited by the United States and its allies regarding parallel United Nations security resolutions on Kuwait and Palestine. It was outraged by the moral hypocrisy of all Western and some Arab leaders concerning the two issues. Nevertheless, the Gulf War has introduced an official Arab political economic fault line, which, if not bridged, is bound to affect negatively Arab state support for the Palestinians. We already see signs of this emanating from Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Additionally, the post-Gulf War U.S. plans for stabilizing the Middle East also do not augur well for the Palestinian people. U.S. policies include first, Gulf security structure, second, regional arms control, third, economic recovery, fourth, resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. On the surface, these U.S. plans sound reasonable and necessary, but on closer scrutiny, they augur ominously for the future of the region and the Palestinian people. The Bush administration outlines a security structure in the Gulf that is close in character to old-fashioned colonial protectorate. With respect to arms control, it already speaks of further arming of its allies and ignoring Israel's nuclear and chemical arsenal. And the plans for, quote, economic recovery look more like a system of financial subsidies to Arab states who joined the anti-Iraq coalition. Finally, with respect to Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Bush administration has reverted to a pre-war business as usual. It restarted the illusory search for alternative Palestinians to the PLO to speak and negotiate on behalf of the Palestinian people. An especially bizarre practice in view of the fact that the whole world, except for the US and Israel, recognized the PLO as a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. During the recent meetings with French President Mitterrand, President Bush enunciated his administration's policy regarding the Palestine question. He said no to the PLO, no to the Palestinian self-determination, and no to Palestinian statehood. Armed with these three no's, the Bush-Baker team expects to solve the Palestine question and the Arab-Israeli conflict. It is in this context of the post-Gulf War that our symposium this morning considers the Palestinians after the Gulf War, the critical questions. The speakers today are well known. On my far right will be the first speaker, Professor Naseer Aruri, Professor of Political Science at Southeastern Massachusetts University, will address Palestinian options. To his left is Mr. Rami Khouri, who will discuss who represents the Palestinians. Mr. Khouri is a well-known journalist in Jordan. To my left is Ms. Hanan Ashrawi, who will investigate Israel's real intentions. She's professor of literature at Birzeit University. To her left is Muhammad Hallaj, editor of Palestine Perspective, who will discuss, will the United States aid or obstruct lasting settlement? And to his left is Professor Sharabi, who will consider what next the question of substance and procedure. Naseer Aruri is professor of political science at Southeastern Massachusetts University. He is author of numerous articles and books dealing with the modern Middle East and the Palestine question. His most recent book is entitled Occupation: Israel over Palestine. He is active in the human rights movement and currently serves on the board of directors of Middle East Watch, a New York-based human rights organization. Dr. Aruri.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Farsoon. An analysis of the Palestinian options in the aftermath of the Gulf requires three things: a context in which to set the evolution of the Palestinian diplomatic strategy, the constraints, second, under which the Palestinian community had to operate, and thirdly, the new conditions created by the war and their impact on the options of the Palestinians. I only have time to summarize the last two, that is to say the constraints and the conditions. The Palestinians have been making concessions one after another over the past 20 years for the sake of peace and for the sake of a historic compromise. They moved away from the idea of a democratic secular state to the notion of an independent Palestinian state. They made a unilateral recognition of Israel. They renounced rather than denounced terrorism. And they also agreed in 1989 to, in effect, make the PLO an interlocutor for Palestinian, for West Bank and Gaza Palestinians. By the end of 1988, these concessions, for the sake of historic compromise, I thought had bottomed out. The Palestinians seized the initiative, but lost it in the following spring when the Shamir government, at the behest of the Bush administration, introduced and later withdrew the so-called election plan. But the PLO made yet another concession by opting against rejecting the charade and by agreeing to become, in effect, the interlocutor to deliver Palestinian leadership inside the occupied territories. The Shamir government had, however, balked at that, even though it was simply being challenged by Washington to agree to talks that would represent less than 1/4 of the Palestinian people, to produce talks about the final disposition of less than 1/4 of what was Palestine only 42 years before. That process, however, so-called peace process, which really came to be a mechanism to obstruct peace, came to a halt when Mr. Baker said in frustration, "Here is our telephone number," to the Israelis basically, "if interested in peace, call us." Now, the suspension of that process led the PLO to shift its primary diplomatic focus in the Arab world from Egypt to Iraq, in the hope that Iraq was assuming responsibility for mutual deterrence vis-à-vis Israel in order to effect a historic compromise, not in order to fight Israel, but in order to bring about a solution based on the two states. But even before George Bush decided to go to war against Iraq, media analysts in this country and in the West declared the Palestinian cause among the prominent casualties of that war. Their assumption was that the Palestinians were allied with Iraq, irrespective of the fact that the PLO did not align itself with Iraq, irrespective of the fact that Arafat attempted to play the role of a mediator, irrespective of the fact that the Intifada leadership had unequivocally condemned the occupation of Iraq, of Kuwait by Iraq, just as it condemned the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza by Israel. However, in practical terms, neither the PLO's hope for mediation nor the Intifada's insistence on a single standard for aggression and the application of UN resolutions would improve Palestinian fortunes in the US political arena. What did count was the fact that they were seen on the wrong side. Bush has already stated the other day, 2 weeks ago, that the Palestinians have backed the wrong horse. These are his words, implying that they should be ready to receive the punishment. It is rather interesting how Bush linked Iraq and Palestine to deny the fundamental rights of the Palestinian people, but yet he was trying to de-link the two when linkage upheld these rights. Well, would a more compliant attitude on the part of the Palestinians have yielded a viable remedy for their plight, or at the least saved them from the imminent disaster awaiting them? The question itself, in my opinion, wrongly assumes that there had existed diplomatic progress in the past, which now would be abandoned as a form of punishment. That simply is not the case, given the rejectionist policy of the United States for more than 2 decades. I think that whatever the US does with the Arab-Israeli conflict in the aftermath of the Gulf War will be reflective of shifting regional alignments. It is likely to be consonant with a solidified US-Israeli alliance. It will not be in reality, though it may be in appearance, the result of a perceived Palestinian stand on the Gulf War. For the United States, this is the first opportunity in the aftermath of the war. It is the first opportunity to reshape the strategic balance in the Middle East without the countervailing influence of the Soviet Union and in the absence of a single Arab power which possesses responsibility for mutual deterrence vis-à-vis Israel. As for Israel, this is also the first time since the peace treaty with Egypt in 1979 that a number of Arab states seem ready to conclude peace with it, which is not subject to Palestinian approval. This does not augur well for Palestinian options that I am supposed to talk about, beyond the election charade. Free elections under Israeli military rule to represent the Palestinians in talks with Israel on what kind of autonomy they could exercise in Ramallah and Nablus, instead of voting in a referendum on who should represent them, and instead of being able to elect their own parliament. Why, we must ask, does the Bush administration celebrate democracy and free elections in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe and deny these elections to the Palestinian people? Didn't Baker declare Israel's unfree elections, their proposed unfree elections, as the only game in town? This formulation have left the Palestinian without any hope of exercising self-determination on Palestinian land. Now that the war is over, American rejectionism has not only stiffened, but it has gained more support among the Arab members of the coalition. Egypt and some of the family regimes in the Gulf Peninsula have already signaled a retreat from the Arab consensus. The Arab consensus enshrined in the summit conferences of Rabat in 1974, Fez in 1982, Amman in 1987, and Algiers in 1988. Recent statements appearing in the Wall Street Journal attributed to top Saudi diplomats in this country indicated a preference to declare the Palestinian state in Jordan. That would ensure a punishment by the Saudis for both the Jordanians and the Palestinians for their bad behavior as seen by the Saudis. That would place Saudi Arabia in close proximity to the present Israeli inclinations and to Washington's own leanings. Another example of retreat on the part of the Arabs was, of course, Mubarak's recent declaration against the idea of an international peace conference. Equally ominous was the statement made by Mubarak's advisor, Osama al-Baz, to the Boston Globe, to Mr. Greenaway, some 3 weeks ago that an interim solution that did not require Israel to make a territorial withdrawal might be acceptable, to use his words, providing it would not constitute a permanent solution. Kuwait, together with other Gulf states and Egypt, have joined the efforts of the US and Israel to re-demonize Yasser Arafat and to delegitimize his leadership. Those Arab members of the coalition have been integrated more than ever to the structure of US power in the region. They are not likely to convince Washington to give up its rejectionist policy. But even if they tried, which in my opinion is unlikely, the Bush administration would have to balance any feeble attempts that they might come up with against its own obligations to the pro-Israel lobby in the US, which was, after all, instrumental in the passage of the congressional resolution to use force. After all, Bush's record-breaking popularity in the polls and his much-touted world order would not exist had it not been for that resolution, which paved the way for his military victory and for his popularity. The outcome of the Gulf crisis has so radically altered the balance of power in the region that it is impossible for the Palestinians to achieve their minimal goals under US diplomatic auspices. And yet, there is no alternative to a settlement based on self-determination and the right of the people to designate their own representatives if the settlement is to be comprehensive and enduring. The current demonizing of the PLO does not remove the fact that it is the only organization capable of supplying legitimacy, capable of negotiating an agreement that would require the Palestinians to renounce historic claims and fundamental rights for the sake of a realistic compromise. So the question is, do the Israelis want peace or do they not want peace? Neither the sponsorship of short-term band-aid solutions involving the use of force, intimidation, and display of vindictiveness, nor the enunciation of rejectable plans, such as the US has been doing with Camp David, the Reagan plan, the Schultz plan, the Baker plan. None of them has ever worked during the past quarter of a century and will not work now. The window of opportunity, quote unquote, which Mr. Baker discovered in his recent trip to Riyadh and Damascus, will not provide an opportunity for a stable political and economic order in the Middle East unless the principle of support for the integrity of nations and human rights is universally applied. That requires a comprehensive settlement based on self-determination. For the Palestinian people, there is no other viable option. Now, in the end, how can the Palestinians pursue that option, which is the only option? Under the severe constraints in the regional and international environments which I have outlined. Well, my modest opinion here is that they would have to begin a serious, systematic, thorough, and rigorous campaign to mobilize the world community to support the principle of international legality. The entire world came to learn that the Security Council had adopted 11 resolutions declaring Iraq as an aggressor, imposing sanctions on Iraq because of its violation of UN resolutions, authorizing the use of force against Iraq because of its refusal to abide by the will of the world community. These resolutions upheld the principle of the inadmissibility of territorial acquisition by force. They held Iraq responsible for damages and reparations. Well, Israel is guilty of all of these. Israel is guilty on all these accounts. And in its latest session, the UN General Assembly voted 151-3, condemning the acquisition of territory by force and asking and upholding the right of the Palestinians to establish their own state. By the way, the only 3 negative votes were those of the US, Israel, and Dominica. I don't know why Dominica. The Palestinians would have to begin with the assumption that the United Nations is a double-edged sword. After a period of UN bashing in this country in the 1970s, the US seems to have rediscovered the United Nations. The US sees in the UN a ready instrument to affect its own policy in the Gulf. Its leaders began to resurrect Wilsonian idealism, bringing back the concept of collective security, peacekeeping, and respect for human rights. I think they should be taken up on that. The Palestinians could use the same sword to challenge the US denial of their own security and their own human rights. After all, the Security Council had adopted no less than 60 resolutions criticizing Israeli aggression, criticizing military occupation by Israel, and Israeli violations of human rights. The US had either used its veto or abstained in the voting on most of these resolutions. It is about time that the Palestinians mobilize the international community to challenge Washington's selective indignation, to insist on applying the rules of international law and the provisions of the UN Charter across the board. There are no good occupations and bad occupations. All occupations are no good. All occupations are illegal. Such a campaign would require a revitalized PLO. It requires renewal, serious reform at every level, in every sphere. These are trying times for the Palestinians. It is a real juncture in Palestinian history. The national institutions of the Palestinians would have to be reshaped and redesigned to accommodate the realities of the 1990s. We must assume that the self-evident truths, so-called, of the 1970s and 80s are no longer self-evident and no longer relevant. The Palestinians must cease to play the role of adjunct in Arab politics. That is not to say that they must move inwardly unto themselves. They need to forge ahead with their own vision, with clarity and determination, methodically and consistently, to translate that solid global consensus on behalf of their rights into a concrete reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Aruri.